Imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where no one questions anything anymore, where people accept whatever information lands in front of them, regardless of its source, accuracy, or agenda, where the phrase, "that's just what I heard," has replaced, "let me think about this." Sounds like science fiction. Look around you. We're already living in that world. Right now, in 2025, we're witnessing something unprecedented in human history: the systematic death of critical thinking. Not the gradual decline that philosophers have warned about for decades, but an accelerated collapse that's reshaping how entire generations process reality itself. What you're about to discover isn't just another commentary on social media or education. This is an urgent wake-up call about a cognitive crisis that threatens the very foundation of rational society. We're not just losing the ability to think critically, we're actively being programmed not to. The mechanisms destroying our capacity for independent thought are more sophisticated and intentional than most people realize. There are powerful forces that benefit enormously from a population that doesn't ask probing questions, and they've turned the manipulation of human psychology into a precise science. Before we dive deep into this investigation, we need you to do something crucial. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button if you're already sensing the gravity of what we're discussing, and drop a comment with the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something important. Share this with someone who still believes in the power of questioning everything, because what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you process information forever. Over the next 32 minutes, we'll reveal the hidden mechanisms destroying our capacity for independent thought, expose the forces that benefit from our intellectual passivity, identify the specific psychological vulnerabilities being exploited, examine the catastrophic consequences we're already witnessing, and most importantly, show you exactly how to fight back and reclaim your mental freedom. The revelation waiting at the end of this journey isn't just alarming. It's the key to understanding why rational discourse is collapsing around us and what we can do to restore it. Are you ready to see how deep this manipulation goes? Let's start with a simple but devastating question. When was the last time you sat with an uncomfortable idea long enough to really think it through? When did you last resist the urge to immediately Google something just to settle your curiosity? If you can't answer that immediately, you're already experiencing what neuroscientists are calling cognitive rewiring. Dr. Anna Lemke, author of Dopamine Nation and professor of psychiatry at Stanford, has identified something terrifying in our relationship with information. She explains that our brains are now wired for what she calls dopamine-driven information consumption. We're not seeking knowledge anymore. We're chasing the neurochemical hit that comes from instant answers. Think about this for a moment. We've turned learning into a drug. The statistics are staggering. The average person checks their phone 144 times per day, according to recent data from Rescue Time. That's once every 6.5 minutes during waking hours. But here's the crucial distinction that everyone misses. We're not just consuming information, we're consuming the feeling of being informed. There's a massive difference between actually understanding something and experiencing the dopamine hit of instant gratification. The neuroscientist Dr. David Eagleman's groundbreaking research at Stanford reveals something even more disturbing. Our brains are literally rewiring themselves to expect immediate gratification from information seeking. The patient, methodical process of critical analysis, the kind of sustained thinking that built civilization, that produced scientific breakthroughs, that enabled democratic discourse, is being systematically overwritten by what he calls cognitive fast food. This isn't just about shortened attention spans or digital addiction. We're witnessing the emergence of what we might call answer addiction, the compulsive need to resolve uncertainty instantly rather than sitting with questions long enough to develop genuine understanding. When we outsource our thinking to algorithms and search engines, we're essentially performing intellectual amputation, cutting away the very cognitive muscles that make us human. But why does this matter so profoundly? Because critical thinking isn't just about getting the right answer, it's about developing the mental strength to navigate complexity, uncertainty, and contradiction. And the forces engineering this cognitive rewiring understand exactly what they're taking away from us. Here's where things become truly disturbing. and where we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. The platforms we use every day aren't accidentally creating echo chambers. They're engineering them with surgical precision. This isn't a bug in the system, it's the primary feature. Former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris, who worked inside these systems before becoming their most prominent whistleblower, has exposed what he calls the attention economy's exploitation of cognitive vulnerability. These platforms use something called engagement optimization algorithms that specifically feed us information that confirms our existing beliefs, because confirmatory information keeps us scrolling longer, clicking more, and generating more advertising revenue. But here's the psychological trap that most people completely miss. When we're constantly exposed to information that confirms what we already believe, our brains interpret this as evidence of our superior judgment. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner and author of Thinking Fast and Slow, calls this confirmation bias amplification, and it's making us intellectually arrogant while simultaneously making us more ignorant. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking work on cognitive dissonance shows us why this manipulation is so devastatingly effective. When humans encounter information that contradicts their beliefs, they experience genuine psychological discomfort. It feels unpleasant, like physical pain. Social media platforms have essentially created an environment where we never have to experience this discomfort, which means we never have to grow intellectually. Consider this statistic that should alarm everyone who cares about democracy. According to the Reuters Institute's Digital News Report, 42% of people now get their news primarily from social media algorithms. These aren't neutral information delivery systems. They're sophisticated persuasion engines designed to keep you engaged, not to keep you informed. The distinction is crucial, and the implications are catastrophic. The result? We're creating what sociologist Zeynep Tufekci calls enclaved publics, groups of people who share the same physical reality but inhabit completely different informational universes. They're not just disagreeing about conclusions anymore, they're operating from entirely different sets of facts. When did you last actively seek out information that challenged your worldview? When did you last engage with an argument that made you genuinely uncomfortable? If you can't answer that immediately, you're already living in the echo chamber. But the algorithm-driven isolation is just one piece of a much larger and more systematic operation. What we're about to reveal might be the most important insight in this entire investigation. The death of critical thinking isn't accidental, it's strategic. There are powerful interests that benefit enormously from a population that doesn't ask probing questions, and they've turned the manipulation of human psychology into a precise science. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely, professor at Duke University and author of Predictably Irrational, has documented over 200 cognitive biases that affect human decision-making. These aren't flaws in our thinking, they're mental shortcuts that helped our ancestors survive in small tribal environments. But in the information age, these same cognitive features are being deliberately exploited by people who understand your psychology better than you do. Take the availability heuristic. Our tendency to judge the likelihood of events based on how easily we can recall similar instances. Media companies and political operatives know that if they can make certain stories more memorable and frequently repeated, they can literally reshape what people believe is probable or important. They're not just reporting news, they're manufacturing perception. Dr. Robert Cialdini, author of Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion, has identified 6 primary psychological triggers that bypass rational thought entirely: reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. Modern information warfare uses all 6 simultaneously, creating what he calls the perfect storm of persuasion. Here's a concrete example that should make your blood run cold. During the 2024 election cycle, researchers at MIT's Laboratory for Social Machines found that false information spreads 6 times faster than true information on social media platforms. But it's not spreading faster because people are gullible. It's spreading faster because false information is specifically engineered to trigger our cognitive biases more effectively than truth. Think carefully about the last time you shared something on social media without fact-checking it, What was it about that information that made you want to share it immediately? Was it because it made you angry? Because it confirmed something you already believed? Because it made you feel like you had inside knowledge? Because it triggered your sense of moral outrage? Every one of those responses was predicted and engineered by someone who understands your psychological vulnerabilities better than you do. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing realization of all. Here's a question that should terrify every parent and educator. What if our entire educational system is accidentally training students not to think critically? What if the very institutions we trust to develop young minds are instead producing sophisticated followers who mistake information consumption for understanding? Dr. Hannah Arendt, one of the most important political theorists of the 20th century, warned about this exact scenario decades before it became reality. She argued that when education becomes focused on producing correct answers rather than developing questioning minds, we're not creating educated citizens, we're creating what she called sophisticated barbarians. The data is absolutely staggering and should serve as a wake-up call for everyone concerned about the future of democratic society. According to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, only 31% of American high school seniors can analyze and evaluate evidence in arguments. That means nearly 70% of graduating students lack the basic cognitive tools necessary for democratic participation. But here's what's really happening in classrooms across the world, and why this crisis is accelerating rather than improving. Students are being trained to optimize for standardized tests rather than developing intellectual curiosity. Dr. Alfie Kohn's extensive research shows that this teaching-to-the-test methodology actually suppresses the kind of divergent thinking that produces innovation, creativity, and deep understanding. Teacher Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator and philosopher, called this the banking model of education, where teachers deposit information into passive student accounts rather than engaging in what he termed critical pedagogy that develops analytical thinking skills. Students learn to be receptacles for information rather than generators of insight. Consider this honestly. When was the last time you were in an educational setting where you were rewarded for asking a question that didn't have a clear answer? Were you praised for identifying contradictions in the material rather than memorizing it? Where intellectual curiosity was valued more than test performance? The result is what educational psychologist Carol Dweck calls learned helplessness around complex thinking. Students graduate believing that every question has a right answer that someone else knows, rather than understanding that the most important questions are the ones where we have to think for ourselves. But even this educational malpractice is just a symptom of something deeper. We need to confront something that's happening in our culture that nobody wants to acknowledge. We're systematically devaluing the kind of slow, patient, difficult thinking that produces genuine insight and wisdom. We've created a society that rewards quick answers over deep questions. Sociologist Richard Sennett has documented what he calls the culture of the new capitalism, an economic system that rewards speed and adaptability over expertise and deep knowledge. In this environment, spending months or years developing mastery in any domain is seen as inefficient. We want instant expertise, immediate solutions, and quick fixes to complex problems. Think about how we talk about intelligence now. We celebrate people who can give quick, confident answers rather than those who ask probing questions. We admire thought leaders who can reduce complex issues to tweet-sized insights rather than scholars who acknowledge complexity and uncertainty. We've confused information processing speed with wisdom. Dr. Susan Jacoby, author of The Age of American Unreason, has identified what she calls the glorification of ignorance, a cultural phenomenon where being too smart or overthinking things is seen as a social liability rather than an intellectual asset. We mock people who think too deeply about important questions. Here's a concrete example from business culture. The phrase paralysis by analysis is routinely used to dismiss careful consideration of complex decisions. The implication is that thinking too deeply about important choices is a character flaw rather than intellectual rigor. We've created a culture that treats thoughtfulness as a weakness. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum warns that we're creating what she calls citizens without souls, people who are technically educated but lack the capacity for the kind of deep reflection that democracy requires. When was the last time you heard someone praised for changing their mind based on evidence? When did you last see intellectual humility treated as a virtue rather than weakness? This cultural shift didn't happen by accident. It's the result of specific economic and political incentives that benefit from a population that makes quick, emotional decisions rather than slow, rational ones. And the consequences are becoming catastrophic. Let's paint a clear picture of what we're losing, not just as individuals, but as a civilization capable of solving complex problems and maintaining democratic institutions. The stakes couldn't be higher. On a personal level, the death of critical thinking is creating what psychologist Viktor Frankl would call existential emptiness. When we can't think deeply about meaning, purpose, and values, we become vulnerable to what he termed the will to pleasure and the will to power, the pursuit of immediate gratification and dominance over others rather than genuine fulfillment. Dr. Sherry Turkle's research at MIT shows that people who can't engage in sustained reflection are significantly more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and what she calls tethered intimacy, relationships that feel connected but lack genuine understanding. They're constantly connected but chronically lonely. But the social consequences are even more alarming and represent a direct threat to democratic institutions. Political scientist Stephen Levitsky's research on democratic backsliding shows that societies lose their democratic institutions not through dramatic coups, but through the gradual erosion of what he calls democratic norms, including the fundamental expectation that citizens will engage in rational deliberation about public issues. Here's a statistic that should wake up every person who cares about democracy. According to the Pew Research Center, 91% of Americans now believe that people with opposing political views can't even understand basic facts correctly. We're not just polarized. We're living in completely separate realities, making democratic discourse virtually impossible. On a civilizational level, we're facing what historian Yuval Noah Harari calls the useless class problem. If artificial intelligence can process information faster than humans, and humans lose the ability to think critically about complex problems, what happens to human agency in the most important decisions facing our species? Consider this sobering reality. Every major challenge facing humanity, climate change, wealth inequality, technological disruption, global health crises, the rise of authoritarianism, requires exactly the kind of sustained, collaborative, critical thinking that we're systematically eliminating from human culture. But there's hope, and the solution is more radical and empowering than you might expect. Here's the revelation we promised you at the beginning, the deepest truth about why critical thinking is dying and what we can do about it. This insight will change everything about how you approach information and decision-making. The death of critical thinking isn't primarily a technological problem, or an educational problem, or even a political problem. It's a spiritual crisis, a disconnection from our fundamental human capacity to wonder, question, and discover truth through our own mental effort. What we're witnessing isn't just the loss of thinking skills, it's the loss of the questioning consciousness that makes us distinctly human. But here's the empowering truth that changes everything. Critical thinking isn't just a skill you learn. It's your birthright as a conscious being. Every time you pause before accepting information, every time you ask why or how do we know this, every time you sit with uncertainty instead of rushing to judgment, you're not just thinking better, you're reclaiming your intellectual sovereignty. The forces that benefit from your intellectual passivity are powerful, but they're not all powerful. They can manipulate your attention, engineer your environment, and exploit your cognitive biases, but they cannot think for you. That capacity remains permanently and inviolably yours, and it's more powerful than any algorithm or propaganda campaign. What we're about to share with you are 9 specific practices that will not only restore your critical thinking capacity, but make you intellectually immune to manipulation. These aren't just techniques, they're acts of cognitive rebellion. Solution 1. The daily question practice. Start each day by writing down one question you have no immediate answer to, not a Googleable fact, but a genuine puzzle about life, reality, or meaning. Spend 15 minutes thinking about it without seeking external input. This rebuilds your tolerance for uncertainty and strengthens your capacity for independent thought. Solution 2. The opposition challenge. Once per week, actively seek out the strongest possible argument against something you believe strongly. Don't look for weak strawman versions. Find the most compelling, intellectually honest opposition you can find. Your goal isn't to change your mind, but to understand why intelligent, well-meaning people might disagree with you. Solution 3. The source mapping exercise. Before accepting any piece of information, ask yourself 3 crucial questions. Who benefits if I believe this? What evidence would change my mind? What am I not being told? This simple practice will make you immune to most forms of manipulation. Solution 4. The long-form reading commitment. Read at least one book per month that challenges your worldview. Not articles, not summaries, but full-length books by serious thinkers who disagree with you. This rebuilds your capacity for sustained attention and complex reasoning while exposing you to sophisticated arguments. Solution 5. The Socratic dialogue practice. Once per week, engage in what Socrates called elenctic questioning. Ask someone you disagree with a series of genuine questions designed to understand their reasoning rather than defeat their argument. Listen to understand, not to rebut. Solution 6. The information fast. Take a complete 24-hour break from all news and social media once per week. Use this time for reflection, reading, or face-to-face conversation. Notice how this affects your anxiety levels and your ability to think clearly about important issues. Solution 7. The Bias Recognition Journal. Keep a daily record of moments when you catch yourself falling for cognitive biases or emotional manipulation. This isn't about self-judgment. It's about developing what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, thinking about your thinking. Solution 8. The teaching test. Once per month, try to explain something complex to someone else without using any external resources. If you can't explain it clearly and simply, you don't understand it deeply enough. This forces you to identify gaps in your knowledge and reasoning. Solution 9. The assumption audit. Every week, identify one belief you hold strongly and write down all the assumptions underlying that belief. Then systematically examine each assumption. Is it true? How do you know? What would happen if it weren't true? These practices will transform more than just your thinking. They'll transform your relationship with reality itself. You'll start to notice that most of what passes for public discourse is emotional manipulation designed to trigger reactions rather than promote understanding. You'll develop what the ancient Stoics called the discipline of assent, the ability to withhold judgment until you have sufficient evidence. You'll become comfortable with saying, "I don't know," and "I need to think about that more." You'll discover that intellectual humility is actually a superpower. Most importantly, you'll discover that thinking critically isn't just about being right, it's about being free. When you can think for yourself, you become immune to the fear-based manipulation that controls most people's political, economic, and social decisions. You become truly autonomous. Here's an honest confession. This investigation began because we recognized how much our own thinking had been compromised. We were falling into the same traps as everyone else, consuming information without questioning it, sharing content without verifying it, believing we were informed when we were actually just being manipulated by sophisticated psychological operations. It wasn't until we started practicing these cognitive disciplines that we realized how much of our mental life had been hijacked by other people's agendas. The process of reclaiming our thinking was like waking up from a dream we didn't know we were having. The clarity that comes from genuine critical thinking is unlike anything else. The benefits go far beyond just being a better thinker. When you can think critically, you make better decisions about relationships, career, health, and meaning. You become less anxious because you're not constantly reacting to manipulated information. You become more creative because you're not trapped in predetermined thought patterns. But this is about more than individual improvement. It's about the survival of rational civilization itself. Let us leave you with the central insight that should guide everything you do moving forward. In an age of infinite information and algorithmic manipulation, the most revolutionary act you can perform is thinking for yourself. The death of critical thinking isn't inevitable. It's a choice we're making every time we accept easy answers, avoid difficult questions, or delegate our judgment to external authorities. But every moment offers us the opportunity to choose differently. The forces trying to control your thinking are powerful, but they have one fatal weakness. They need your consent. Your mind is the final frontier of human freedom. No matter what happens in the external world, no matter how sophisticated the manipulation becomes, your capacity to think critically remains yours to develop and protect. Every time you pause to think, every time you ask a probing question, every time you resist the urge for immediate certainty, you're withdrawing your consent from the system that profits from your intellectual passivity. So here's our challenge to you. Start today. Pick one of the 9 practices we've outlined and commit to it for the next week. Notice how it changes not just what you think, but how you think. Tell us in the comments what surprised you most in this investigation and which practice you're going to start with. Like this video if it makes you question something you previously took for granted, and subscribe for more explorations into the forces shaping our minds and our world. Most importantly, share this with someone who still believes that truth matters more than comfort, that questions matter more than answers, and that thinking for yourself is the most important skill you can develop in the 21st century. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the critical thinking crisis. Your willingness to engage with difficult ideas gives hope for the future of human consciousness. Keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep fighting for your intellectual freedom. Until next time, stay awake, stay curious, and never stop thinking for yourself.